Something else that comes up a lot in these groups is how much pro to translation are you? I understand that it can be difficult using it in multicultural groups, especially. But we
Yeah,
have a lot here in Brazil speakers of Portuguese as their first language. So
of course.
it's teachers tend to question themselves as, oh, should I be using translation? How much should I?
So my first feeling about this is that if you are a Portuguese speaker and you've learned English and you're working with monolingual Portuguese speaking groups, you have an incredible superpower that you shouldn't allow yourself to be deprived of. I think this whole kind of English only monolingual kind of idea about the classroom really comes from monolingual native speakers who are working with multilingual groups. It's also a way of monolingual native speakers keeping hold of the power in English language teaching, because we're scared of what people like you can do in your classroom. So for me, I think this idea of, I want my students to think in English, well, that's a lovely ambition, but it's probably not going to happen. Even as an advanced speaker of Indonesian, I use English all the time. So when I'm reading Indonesian or I'm listening to Indonesian and I see something I don't know, the way that I work out what it means is I look it up in a bilingual dictionary, and I then probably make a bilingual set of Quizlet cards or flashcards, and I test myself. If I'm speaking Indonesian with someone who also speaks English and I don't know how to say something, I will stop speaking Indonesian and I will say, kamu kira bagaimana dalam bahasa Inggris bisa bilang, and then I'll say the English thing, and then hopefully they'll say the Indonesian thing. That use of your own first language as a way of decoding the second language and as a way of trying to find out what it is that's best to say in the second language by moving from first language to second language, everybody does this. You know, I've never met a language learner who doesn't do this, but teachers still pretend that somehow this doesn't happen and that we have to pretend that this isn't going on.
Or shouldn't, right?
Yeah, or we shouldn't, yeah. And what then happens is you're just driving the translation underground. And I know it from myself. So many times I'm teaching and I'll kind of stop and go, hey, you guys, come on, can you stop speaking Chinese? And they'll say, hey, we're explaining what you just said to him because he didn't get it. And you kind of realize they're not talking Chinese because they're causing problems. They're doing it as a survival strategy. It's like bringing the weakest guy with them. They got me, but the weak guy didn't. And so they're doing that mediation. In terms of how you use it, I would say that banning it's stupid. And I think schools that ban it are de-skilling teachers, and I think teachers who don't allow themselves to do it are de-skilling themselves. I think the issue is how you use it, where, when, and why. So, I mean, at the lowest levels, I would say probably 50% of the class needs to be in L1. I'm doing beginner level Russian at the moment. If I wasn't doing it with a teacher who also spoke fluent English, I would have given up already. Even when I'm listening to little basic listenings in Russian, I can understand them, but I can't say what I heard in Russian. So I can say, yeah, I understood it. He was saying that's his wife and that she's a teacher. And my teacher will say, can you remember it in Russian? So, of course not. You know, I understood it, but I can't tell you in L2 what they said. So at that level, I think it's crucial. I think sometimes in terms of just dealing with the basic meaning, using translation is the shortest and easiest route. So if you're teaching an IELTS class or a TOEFL class and someone says, what does frog mean? You know, you can explain it and draw a picture of it or look for or you can just say it in Portuguese and they say, oh yeah, it's that. Sometimes even if you explain it in English, you know, you kind of say, it's a small green animal, it goes ribbit, it jumps up and down, it lives in the end they say, oh, it's this in my language. It's like, oh. I could have done that much more quickly.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is what you're using translation for. And I think there's two very obvious principled times that it's necessary. One is if students are engaged in meaningful speaking and they lapse into Portuguese, almost certainly it's because they don't know how to say something in English and they want to convey their message. And I think in those instances, a good teacher will just make a note of that and then during the feedback say, I heard some great stories. So, you know, Jorge, you were talking about blah, blah, blah. And you said in Portuguese, blah, 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 blah. Anyone know how to say that in English? Here it is. I think the other thing that's really good to do is two-way translation, where you take a sentence, not a single word, not necessarily a grammatical thing, but just a sentence, and you put it into L1, and then later you put it back into L2. I first started doing this years ago. I had a French guy I was teaching called Pascal, and he was somehow in my first certificate class. And basically, Pascal used to speak French in English. So he would say things like, for me, it is not necessary to study the grammar because all the people with whom I'm speaking are saying I'm comprehensible. And I would say, you think you don't need to study grammar because everyone understands you? This is what I am telling. No, it's not. You said it basically translating directly from French. I said it the normal English way, but it is equivalent. No, it's not the same. It's not the same. And what I started doing with him was giving him sentences, just things like, I haven't seen you for ages. And I would ask him to translate it into French. And then a week later, I'd show him the French and I'd tell him to translate it into English. And to begin with, he hated this. He was like, I am thinking already in English. So, of course you are, yeah. And what he would do is, he'd see the English, he'd translate it into French easily because he understood it. When he translated it back, he would say something like, oh, this sentence in English, it is a long time since I did not see you. And I would say, are you sure? You sure that's the English? It is the same in French. Okay, are you sure? It is a long time since I did not see you. Let's check. Oh, I haven't seen you for ages. The same or different, Pascal? And you can see him kind of going, So what I've been doing all my life is seeing English, understanding English, translating English into first language, and then when I need to express that idea in second language, translating directly. And that kind of two-way translation is a way of catching that and making students more aware of the fact that what they're actually doing is translating literally, and what they need to do is to recognize, so if you translate the French directly into English, it's a long time since I didn't see you. However, in English, they don't do it like that. They say, I haven't seen you for ages. And he started kind of realizing, so the languages actually aren't the same. And I think particularly for people like Portuguese speakers, Spanish, French, Italian speakers, there's a kind of block that happens at around intermediate level because the languages are kind of similar. You can go a long way with a little bit of knowledge, but at some point you have to accept and recognize, but we do it differently in Portuguese to the way they do it in English. And that two-way translation as a kind of revision tool or a kind of, a memory aid is a really useful way of catching that, I think. So I think whatever you do, don't ban it. Recognize that, you'll know a lot of the reasons why your students are saying things. If you're working with other Portuguese speakers, it'll be like, you're saying that because in Portuguese we say blah, blah, blah. It's different in English. And if you have that knowledge, it seems crazy to me that you would deprive yourself of the ability to use that knowledge, because that's a great talent that so-called non-native speaker teachers have. You should be encouraged to be using that in a principled way.
Seems like a good idea to guide students through how to translate something appropriately.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's something that they will be doing eventually.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of the time, even outside of the classroom, translation's one of the big things they'll be doing,
Especially outside of the classroom, right?
You're the guy in the office and they kind of go, Arthur, you speak English, mate. Translate this thing and tell us what it means. And, you're the guy who has to read the document and say in Portuguese what it means. Or you'll be working with foreign people who are saying, so read that thing, the Portuguese thing you've got there, and tell us in English what that is. That's a really common thing. Or, you're hanging out with someone in a bar in Sao Paulo and they want to know what was that conversation you just had. That's a kind of really common way that we interact with languages, It's recognizing the role of first language in that, and not running away from that in horror.
You dipped the toe a little bit in one of the questions I also have prepared for this interview, which is some teachers and some students sometimes, they come with the idea that the classes are going to be 100% in English, which is something that's fairly easy to do from A2 learners onwards, but it's something that's a bit challenging with low-level learners such as A1 students, pre-A1 and A1 students. So what are your 2 cents on that?
The story I always tell about this is the first time I went to France. Like a lot of English kids, I did French as my main foreign language at school. And I think we started at 14 and I did my O-level when I was 16. And when we were 16, we went on a kind of exchange trip to France. Me and a friend of mine, we sneaked off from the main group and we went off somewhere in Paris. And we had to find the train station, Le Gare du Nord. We spoke a little bit of French, so we got lost and we stopped this guy. This is in the days before phones and Google Maps and all that. So we stopped this guy and said, excusez-moi, monsieur, nous sommes perdus. Nous cherchons le Gare du Nord, la station de Gare du Nord. Like, sorry, mister, we're lost. We're looking for the Gare du Nord. And this French guy sort of went, oh, oui, 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 nous avons une église, nous avons le parc, à la gauche. And we were sort of going, great. Thank you. Not a clue. And afterwards, we did what any normal human being would do. We sort of sat there and we laughed a lot and sort of went, did you understand anything? And then my friend said, in English, I think he mentioned an église. And I said, yeah, église is church, right? And he said, yeah, something about a church, yeah? Église. Yeah. And did you hear the thing about park? Yeah, park, yeah? Yeah, park. So we got to go past the church and then through the park, past the park. And then he said, à la gauche, this is left or right? À la gauche, gauche is left, à la droite is right. Yeah, so we have to go left. Something about church, park, left. Okay, let's try that and see where we go. The idea that we would have done this conversation in French is insane, given that we didn't understand most of it. If we'd then been asked, in French, what did you hear? Well, that would have been a very short conversation. What we would have said was, église, park, à la gauche. That's what I heard in French. For me, then, what that means is, as a teacher, if I'm teaching very low-level students, you give them the chance. You don't tell them necessarily, do it in first language, but you say to them, okay, you're going to hear this thing in English. Compare your ideas in pairs, in English if you can, in Portuguese if not, it doesn't matter. Now let's see what you got. And what they might do is just go, church! And you go, yeah, okay, so you have to go past the church. So you go past the church and then park. Yeah, good. So you go through the park and basically you just take, as a teacher, you take the little bits that students throw you in English and you re-grammar that, you re-lexicalize that and you give that back to them. And, in a way, it's what parents do with kids. When the kids kind of go, want milk? And the parent says, oh, do you want some milk? And then you give them the milk. It's that kind of process. It's yes, I understand your meaning. Yes, you've got the basic idea. Here's what you actually heard. Here's what you're saying to me with the grammar back. So I think it's just doing that a lot. And just accepting, if you want them to mostly speak English in class, they're just going to speak words. They're not going to grammar it. And what you do as a teacher, hey, did you have a good weekend? Yes, good. Shopping. Right, you went shopping. Saturday or Sunday? Saturday. Oh, so you went shopping on Saturday. It's just doing that. It's that kind of accepting what you're giving me, giving it back to you in better English, and just doing that all the time. And if sometimes you say something in Portuguese, I say, yeah, I know what you mean. You bought a new pair of shoes. Yeah.
And build up from there, right?
Building it up and just accepting when you're coming from a low starting point, you use the resources you have, and one of the resources you have is L1. Maybe what you do is you limit the space in class that you allow for that. But to pretend it's not there is a kind of madness, I think.
You mean like throughout the time, like as time goes by, lowers the use of L1.
And scaffolding what students can do and helping them build up what they can do.
Mm-hmm. And most of the classes are a lot about instruction, right? Giving instruction and checking instruction. So students use.
And with very low-level students, some of that can be done in L1. And that's just to do with kind of efficacy in the classroom and ease, procedural ease,
Yeah.